My name is Liz Arcane, and I am a singer, writer, and educator. Versus. Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Versus, where we take a very affectionate look at two connected singers and writers and talk about what it is that makes them so very good. Now, this week we are thinking about Simon and Garfunkel, or separately Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. And both of them have been an astonishingly large part of American music and British music, particularly the folk music movement, since the time that their music was first released in the 1960s. But is one of them better than the other? And does that question even really matter? As you know, if you've listened to the first two episodes, it's kind of the last thing on my mind. Yes, I want to look at the differences between them, but I'm not trying to decide whether one is better than the other as such. It's really just an opportunity to talk about how wonderful they are. And it's true, they are wonderful. Let's think about how they first met, because the background of how these great duos meet is always really fascinating to me. They met in the mid-50s or slightly earlier when they were 11, when they were both performing in a performance of Alice in Wonderland for the school. Now, I imagine, and this is conjecture, that their relationship developed through their love of song and their love of singing and performance. And certainly by the time it gets to 1957, they were regularly writing songs together. And between 1957 and 1964, they wrote more than 30. As well as that, in hindsight, it seems that their ascent to fame was quite quick. They formed as an official duo called Tom and Jerry. In 1964, they signed to Columbia Records. However, it doesn't seem that it was until 1965, when there was a move to England, they began to really go strength to strength. And I've no doubt that is somewhat to do with the English folk music scene, which was so strong at the time. For instance, I believe that move allowed at least Paul Simon to write very honest lyrics, which rather than being marketable, like perhaps the ones for Tom and Jerry were actually about his true feelings. Now, what really marks Paul Simon out for me as a songwriter is the way that he can write relatably about topics that are relevant to him, that are securely sat in the world of him being a singer-songwriter, and therefore to many people would not be relatable. However, it's the way that he writes them and also the way that he sings them. Homeward Bound is one excellent example. Standing in a railway station, got a ticket for my destination. Everyone's done that. And then this idea that he is getting sick of playing gigs and shows and just wants to go home and see his family. And there is a real truth to the emotion in those lyrics, as well as in the mise en scène, the whole picture of the sound, the lyrics, and the way that he sings. Now, we've talked a little bit about Paul Simon. Let's think about Art Garfunkel instead, who I feel does often draw the short straw, so to speak, or perhaps gets put behind Paul Simon, literally on the cover for their greatest hits. Now, Art Garfunkel's vocal background was incredibly different to Paul Simon's. I do know that Art Garfunkel had more of a traditional background musically. For example, he was what we might call a chorister, but in fact it was usually singing in the synagogue, so perhaps chorister is not appropriate. I know that later on he was a cantor. As such, I also know that Paul Simon's mother was quoted as saying something along the lines of, "You sing very well," but Art Garfunkel has what I would call a fine voice. Now, a fine voice is the kind of compliment that any chorister, cantor, anybody doing classical singing of any kind would absolutely love to receive. And what that means to me, as somebody who had a small amount of choral training when I was younger and at school, although I wouldn't say I was a chorister as such, what that means to me is a combination of perfect articulation, excellent control of breath and notes, curiosity about the sound and how to improve it objectively, and as well as that, excellent sight reading and music reading in general. and the ability to blend. I often get the impression that Paul Simon gets put first. I think in part it must be that he was more in charge of the songwriting. It certainly seems that way in hindsight. Art Garfunkel sang on some of the most important and complex songs, such as Bridge Over Troubled Water. However, whilst they had a similar setup to Lennon and McCartney, wherein they were both credited on their recordings equally, it does seem to me that perhaps Paul Simon is the one who did most of the songwriting in reality. What I really like about Paul Simon is the ability he has to communicate in this way to his audience. He has not a choral voice by any measure. Instead, he has a lively, cheeky, full of expression voice, which is very tuneful. It's never off key. Very, very capable of harmonising, but alongside Art Garfunkel, he must sometimes have felt like he was the bridesmaid, so to speak, whilst Art Garfunkel was the vocal bride. And I've no doubt there was a slight reversal of that feeling as well, if you think about this idea that Paul Simon seemed to be put first. However, for me, Paul Simon's voice is the one that appeals to me the most. That liveliness and the connection to the lyrics, where he sings them as though he's just written them and the idea is coming to life through him in that moment. That for me makes perfect mise en scène in terms of the voice, the words, and the sound overall. So again, just like in weeks 1 and 2, I don't feel able to say one is better than the other. I would rather say that one could not exist without the other, and they each were the foil to each other's talent. You can't have Garfunkel without Paul Simon, because, and let's make a guess here, who would write most of the songs? But in the same way, you can't have them without the other. Paul Simon needs Art Garfunkel's vocals to be the bridge over the troubled water of his slightly uneven vocal style occasionally and glue it all together, much as Christine McVie glued the sound of Fleetwood Mac together, even when she wasn't the one in the foreground when they performed. And that brings our 3rd episode of Versus Versus to a close. Thank you so much for listening. I can only ask that you like and follow. Thanks for listening and take care.